In an attempt to not use a green colour palette for March, and let's just ignore the fact that there is blatantly green on that washi tape, I've decided that from here on out, March is going to be a blue month. March was blue last year, March is blue this year. That seems like the start of a tradition. If you know me though, then you know I do like more complex colour palettes than just one colour. So to partner with my blue, I also wanted to incorporate some brown, or more in particular, kind of like a craft paper type brown. Rather than using actual craft paper though, I was really in the mood to use something that had text on it. And because my parents are currently in the process of decluttering their house, and they have a lot of old books, I decided to save one that was destined for the recycling centre to upcycle it into my bullet journal. Previously, I did have another old book that I'd saved from the recycling bin, but anytime I went to use that, because it was a fiction book, I had to kind of be a little bit more mindful of which parts of the story I was sticking into my journal. The text size on that one was also a lot bigger, so the words stood out a little better. So I thought that this cooking book with smaller text would be a little bit safer. Let's just ignore the fact that I decided to pick the poultry section to put into my journal. It would have been much more reasonable to put in a dessert section, given the fact that the theme for today is butterflies, and I'm pretty sure butterflies like sweets, or at least they like flower nectar, in theory. I don't know a lot about butterflies, but anyway. So instead, a good mix of words that I have in my journal now are fat, blood, turkey, chicken, that kind of stuff. Honestly, I'm not really too bothered about it because a lot of it is just going to blend into the background. That's why I picked this one up out of the recycling pile compared to other ones. I also just really loved the aged look of the pages, which was definitely achieved through actual aging because I think this book was printed in 1960. I know that people get a little bit upset about the idea of ripping up books, but given the fact that this one was literally just gonna go into like the recycling center or landfill, I still feel like it's okay to use it in a crafting project like my bullet journal. For me personally, I don't get too, I don't know, upset or worried about the idea of recycling books in this way, or even kind of just recycling books in general. If the book has gotten to a point where realistically it's not going to be used by somebody else, either because the information is outdated or the book is kind of dilapidated, then either recycling the book or turning it into a project like this seems like a pretty reasonable next step. With all that said though, as you can see, I'm sticking the paper down the left-hand side of the page to add some border decoration to the layout. This is something that I repeated through pretty much all of the pages of the setup because I like to use those repeated elements to make everything look cohesive, or like the layouts actually belong together. One of the shortcomings of the book is that it's a little bit too short for the page, so anytime I wanted to use it along the full length of the page, I had to actually use two separate pieces. I tried to make them blend in as best as I could, so making sure that the top corner of one piece sat in the top corner of the layout, and the bottom corner of another sat in the bottom corner of the layout, just because when the pages age, they age around the edge the most. I really liked that darkening effect of the edges, and I wanted to preserve that when I was sticking it into my journal. As said though, this is a butterflies theme, and while I could draw butterflies in myself, I'm a little bit particular about how I want butterflies to look. I'm a little bit of a persnickety biscuit when it comes to them, so I decided to opt instead to use butterfly stickers. These ones are from Journal Say, and they made the decoration so much easier. Plus you get 40 butterflies in a pack, so I'm going to be able to use it for the entire setup of the month. Not just the start of month pages, but also all of my weeklies and dailies and stuff too. Those ones are absolutely gorgeous, and like any of the materials I've used in this setup, they're linked in the description box below. And if you did want to grab yourself something from Journal Say, then you can use code JASHICORINNE for 8% off your order if you want. We love savings. Something that I actually completely forgot about before I started working on this setup is that I've done a butterflies theme before. This one was back in November 2019, and in that one I also used some butterfly stickers, but the ones on my bucket list, mood tracker, and any of my weeklies were all done by hand. As mentioned, I'm a little bit particular about the way butterflies look, so a lot of the ones that are very symmetrical or a lot more detailed took me a long time to do. And while I do like the way this setup looks, the stickers are just way easier. Because of how much of a mission it had been setting up last month, with going in with one idea and then having to change it when things weren't working out and having to try a bunch of different things to actually get it to a place where I liked it, I wanted to make sure that I went into this setup with a plan. Everything was sketched out ahead of time, I knew where decoration pieces were going to go, and I was feeling very good about it. That was until I wrote down the headers on these pages. The headers themselves were fine, but then when I went and put in a subheader and the dot points for my bulleted list, that's when I realized we were gonna have a problem. Although I had swatched these out on a separate piece of paper before I started to make sure that I was happy with the color palette, you know, having all of these elements together, making sure they kind of felt like they matched, when I actually put it into my journal, the colors didn't really work. The blue was way too bright, the brown of the header versus the subheader didn't match, and I honestly felt so defeated because I had gone into this keeping in mind how much trouble I had had last month. That's okay though, we've got this, we know how to do a fix. I ended up covering over those dots with a white sticker label that I just put a different color of dot on, and then also covered over the headers just using some paper from a separate notebook. I did consider using more of the paper from the old book, but I thought that the pale ivory grid matched better with the washi tape that we're using. Hopefully you can kind of see why I started with that brighter blue for the dots though, because if you actually look at the wings of the butterflies, they are quite vibrant. I was testing them over the top of white paper though, because they are slightly transparent. Once you put them over the top of the book pages and the washi tape, it does slightly subdue the colour. While the blue dots I ended up going with aren't a perfect match to what's in the washi tape, they are at a similar saturation level, so I felt okay with using them. When it came to putting the headers on the extra pieces of paper, I didn't want them to just sit out in the middle of nowhere, kind of by themselves, not really looking like they were part of the overall design. And also, once I'd drawn them out, I realized that these new headers were slightly narrower than the ones I had before. To make it so that everything fit together nicely, I decided to do a little bit of layering, using some little scrap pieces from the book paper to put behind the headers. Normally, I'm not much of a fan of using a glue stick in my journal. I usually opt for double-sided tape instead, but in this setup, I found myself using a glue stick quite a lot. And that was mainly because a lot of those smaller pieces of paper were a little bit fiddly to do with the double-sided tape. It was just a little bit easier to use a glue stick. I just tried to make sure that I didn't saturate the back of the page too much, because sometimes I find that my pages warp ever so slightly if I use a glue stick. The actions list, including fixing the title, took about 26 minutes, that one being from first touch of the pen to final erasings, so not including idea generation time or sketching in time. If you haven't come across it before, the actions list is effectively just a place to hold all of the tasks that I want to do as related to my goals, but now we're onto the cover page for cycle 3. On a cover page like this, people would typically put the name of the month, so March, but because I'm doing cyclic planning rather than monthly planning this year, I've been titling all of mine with the cycle number. Each of my cycles is a 4-week period, so cycle 3 goes from the 26th of February to the 24th of March. That last week of March is my reset week, which isn't included in the majority of this setup, though I do have a section for it when it comes to my content plan. A lot of the time with my cover pages, I do just make them decorative. I like to use them as a way to signify the start of a new month or a new cycle, and just kind of use it as a way to break up my journal into those separate sections of time. For this cycle though, I wanted to try something a little bit different and make this a functional page, kind of similar to what we had in January or cycle 1, where I was recording what I was doing with each of my time blocks during a day. I like to consider my days as having kind of 5 or 6 time blocks, so 2 before lunch, 2 after lunch, and then either 1 or 2 after dinner. This time around though, I wanted to simplify it a little bit so I didn't have to write as much down, instead considering 3 blocks of time for the day. So morning, afternoon, and evening. At this stage, I'm kind of planning on maybe color coding them based on what kind of things I'm doing. So a certain color for social or leisure time, another color for work time. I haven't quite sorted out what the colors are going to be, probably some combination of blue and brown, and trying to keep it roughly in the color palette that's already been established, maybe something a little softer, a little less saturated, mainly because I don't want it to compete with the butterflies. I had a little bit of trouble on this page because I ended up drawing it in 1 row higher than I meant to, which meant that when I came to rule it in, I ended up stuffing it up a little bit, but I just decided that rather than make it separate sections for the calendar kind of space at the top and then the lists at the bottom, I was just going to turn it into one larger box with internal lines. As said, that top section is kind of like that time block tracker, so what am I doing with my periods of time each day, and the bottom is just going to be a task list of things to do in the cycle. In particular, things that are outside of my goals, because all of those go on the actions list. The cover page, or kind of cover dashboard, took about 15 minutes from first touch of the pen to final erasings. And before we flip over to the rest of the setup, we're just gonna have a look at how this cycle is going. To be completely honest, my journaling has kind of been off this cycle. I started off fairly well, like, you know, got in, populated stuff. Didn't necessarily populate as much as I would have liked to, so that's something I'm going to be mindful of moving into cycle 3. But once I took my trip to Melbourne in the second week of the cycle, after that my journaling has been very bleh. I haven't really been getting into my journal as much, and although I know it would be beneficial to be in there for my organization, I just haven't been able to make myself do it. A couple people I've talked to said that they had kind of similar feelings towards their journal in February. So I'd be curious, have you had the same feeling this month? Just not really feeling very motivated to get in your journal, finding it difficult to do so, maybe setting stuff up and then feeling kind of about it after the fact? Let me know in the comments, but now it's time to work on my monthly log, or cyclic overview. This one took about 11 minutes to set up, from first touch of the pen to final erasings, but you'll note that I already stuck in my decorative paper here. This was kind of a proof of concept for myself, seeing if I liked the way it looked before I kind of committed to it for the rest of the layout. And that's something that I tend to do before filming a lot of these Plan With Me's, going in and sticking things in ahead of time just to make sure that I like the way they look, so I can change things before I try and do it on camera. It just helps with the editing process, because oftentimes when filming these, they do end up being quite long, and if I'm kind of trying to figure things out as I go while I'm filming, that is a lot of extra footage. For instance, this setup took about 2.5 hours to film in its entirety, and that's not including any of the time that was done behind the scenes. So stuff like the sketching in, the idea generation, sticking in pieces of paper ahead of time, that kind of stuff. It's good to note though, just because it takes me 2.5 hours to film this, doesn't mean it's actually going to take you 2.5 hours to set it up if you were trying to do it yourself. When I'm filming, I need to be mindful of where my journal is at all times, making sure that it's actually in shot so I'm not setting things up where you can't see them. I want to make sure that things are aligned. I'll also make sure that when I'm flipping through the pages, it's done in a fairly fluid manner rather than me like trying to pick up a page and then it falls out of my hand and then the footage kind of looks a little weird. Yes, I am aware that this is a very big tangent, but I just wanted to let you know that just because it takes me this long to film it doesn't mean that the setup will actually take that long. In terms of the function of this page though, this is effectively my monthly log, or what I like to call my cyclic overview. On this page I'm going to capture not only events, but also any content releases that I have coming out. I like this to be an all-in-one kind of layout, so I have a really good summary of everything that's going on throughout the cycle. Because of the amount of information that I want to capture, I made this layout a little bit bigger compared to my previous cycle, so really taking up as much space as I possibly can given the fact that I'm using a square notebook. On this one you can really see that transparency that I mentioned with regards to the butterfly stickers. While it does bother me a little bit that I can see the text through them, and there are technically ways around this, it didn't bother me enough to actually do anything about it. If that was something that was going to bother you, what you can do is stick the butterflies down onto a white sticker label and then cut around them and stick them onto the page. By sticking them onto a white sticker label, at least they're still stuck to something with a sticky back, so they still behave like a sticker, but then because they're stuck on white paper, you won't end up seeing any of that text through them. As said, while it does bother me a little bit, it didn't bother me enough to do anything about it. I'm just going to think of the butterflies as being very delicate, and thus they have slightly transparent wings. I did try to be fairly careful with the placement so that it wasn't too terribly obvious, and I also used the placement of the butterflies to hide some of the words that I feel jumped out a little bit easier, ones that I didn't necessarily want to have my eye drawn to when I was looking at the layout. This spread though is the start of my work outputs layout, which is actually going to take multiple spreads because I've realized that I just want to have all of them in one place, so not just my YouTube videos and my membership perks, but also anything I'm posting on Instagram, anything I'm doing for my goals course, the steps for the Archer and Olive blog post that I write every month, and effectively anything else I can think of. Something that I didn't have in my work outputs layout for cycle 2 was a good overview of when my content was coming out. Yes, this is on the monthly overview layout, but I wanted it to be right next to the checklists to mark off when I've been working on these things, so that I can see, okay, these are all the steps I need to take to get these pieces of content out, alongside this is when the content is coming out, so I can make sure that those things are done in a timely manner. Rather than just using a calendar layout for that overview of when everything's scheduled to release, I decided to do something a little bit different, and having recently watched Erin Smith's setup video for March, in her content schedule she had a layout that had columns for each of the different platforms and rows for each of the different days of the month. I quite liked that idea, but rather than putting it in terms of platform, I wanted to put it in terms of content type. So a column for reels, or like short form vertical videos, a column for photos, a column for text posts. Of course, a column for videos, and then a column for anything else. This way I could see what type of content was coming out on each of the days of the cycle. As mentioned before though, my content plan is where I also included reset week. So rather than just being for 4 weeks, this layout is actually for 5. I'll still have content coming out during reset week, but I don't really want to be working on it during reset week. So I wanted to have a good overview of the things that are going to be coming out then, so I can make sure to do them ahead of time. On each of the subsequent pages though, this is where I'm going to be having all of those checklists related to specific types of content. So for instance, on the right hand side of this spread, we've got a box for videos and the steps that I need to take to prepare all those videos. And then the box at the bottom is for my memberships, or the perks that the members of the team with a capital T get. If you were interested in our memberships program, it's linked in the description box. But effectively the way those boxes work is that I can list out the videos and then the perks along the left hand side, and then on the right I have a column for each of the different tasks or stages that go into preparing that content. I set this layout up as a series of Dutch doors though, and also hid some of the butterfly stickers in amongst the pages, so that I made sure not to accidentally use them earlier in the setup because I specifically wanted them on some of these ones. While the butterfly stickers do technically have a shiny finish, and you might have seen it in particular for the butterflies that are at the top of any of the layouts, I actually find that when they're on the page, the transparent sections blend in really nicely with the paper of the notebook. The best blending happens on the white dot grid paper, but compared to some of the other PET stickers that I've used, or PET tapes, I found that they didn't actually look too bad over other elements either, whether that be those cooking book pages or the washi tape that I put in first. Sometimes when you lay stickers like that over the top, it has a tendency to kind of darken anything that's underneath it, but these ones actually blend in really well. While the first spread of this layout is for that overview and for my memberships and videos, the next one is effectively all about Instagram. So one of the pages is just for reels and the other page is for photos. I'm not really that into making reels. I'm trying to get more into it, obviously, considering I'm dedicating an entire page to it. I've actually currently set myself a challenge to release 1 reel per day, all of them of course being something that's helpful or an idea for your journal, because when it comes to my content, the first thing that comes to mind is providing value, so I'm using reels as a way to share bite-sized ideas for your bullet journal. I love explaining things in depth, and often an in-depth explanation requires a little bit longer than 90 seconds, so it's been kind of a nice challenge to try and cut down on that explanation time, just strip it back to the bare essentials so that people can get the general overview, and if they want more information, they can always come to YouTube for it. In terms of planning this setup though, and in part why I used the Dutch door, I wanted to be able to see the due dates or release dates for the reels and the photos when I turned to this second spread. And that's why you see that the left hand side of the Dutch door lines up perfectly with where the reels and photos columns are on that first overview page. This is also why I put videos and memberships on the first page, because the columns related to that are the furthest to the right on the overview page. Very much a choice made to make these layouts as functional as possible. The way these boxes function is the same as the first page though, so listing out what the content is along the left of each box, and then a column for each of the stages in producing that content. As I complete each stage for each piece of content, I just check it off. On to our next spread though, and this one is again split into 2 halves. On the left hand side is everything related to the podcast, and then on the right is the Archer and Olive blog post and the Year of Planning challenge. If you hadn't heard about the podcast, this is the Planner Pals podcast, hosted by myself and Mark of Mark Your Pages. I was so excited when he reached out to me and asked if I wanted to do this with him. Mark is a very good egg, and we're both very excited about this new venture together. If you hadn't already checked it out, our first episode is already up, but the next episode is coming next week. That one is of course linked in the description box, and I do recommend checking it out. We've both felt very blessed to get such positive feedback from everyone about it, and I'm excited to continue with it. Of course though, this is more content that I'm releasing, so I needed a space to plan it, and this is why my work outputs layout has gone from 1 spread to 4. I was finding that my previous work outputs layouts just weren't capturing everything that I was putting out, which means that things would get missed or delayed, and I want to be better about getting things out in a timely manner. I think that having all of these checklists is also going to be kind of eye-opening with regards to how much I'm actually putting out, just to make sure that I'm not overworking myself or anything like that. In terms of each of the different sections that I have on this layout though, from the top of the left going down, we have the stages of doing the podcast episodes, so things like idea generation, the filming, editing, that kind of stuff. Underneath this, I wanted to list out what the episode titles were, just so that I could keep track of what 2, 3, and 4 actually meant. Below this, we have any of the posts that we're doing on Instagram as related to the podcast, and then the space at the bottom is for anything else that I think of that needs to be done in the podcast space. On the other side of the spread though, the top box is for the Artronol blog post, so just recording each of the different steps that go into making the blog post itself, the photos for the blog post, the printable, the video, the reel, and then the box at the bottom is for the Year of Planning challenge and the steps required for that too. I feel like just with listing those out, I've already made myself feel tired, but flipping over, this spread is going to be for my goal course, or any of the tasks that I have to do in preparation for that. My hope is that I'll be opening it up at the end of March for our founding members, but at this stage there is still a bit of work to be done before it's ready for release, which I suppose is precisely why I've given myself so much space to work with. At this stage, I'm not too sure where I'm going to be up to come the end of this cycle with regards to the stuff that I'm doing for the course, so I've not sectioned out any different spaces for it yet, but on the last day of this cycle, before cycle 3 starts, I'm going to make sure that I have all of those tasks populated in here. Having things set up and fully populated so that I can hit the ground running in cycle 3 is something that's going to be really important for me. As said, I've been kind of in a bit of a planner slump for cycle 2, and I really want to get out of that. I know that having things fully set up for myself is one of the ways that I can do that, so it's gonna be a priority. Obviously in this setup I used a lot of those butterfly stickers, but I still have heaps left over to decorate my fortnightly or weekly or daily setups. But having a look at the layouts that we set up as part of this one, I'm feeling quite positive about these layouts. I know that I went into them with a lot of intentionality, so kind of problem solving any difficulties that I had with cycle 2, and I know that having done that reflective process means that these layouts are likely going to work a lot better than any of the ones I've used this month. If you wanted more March inspiration though, the playlist at the top is the next one to check out, or if you're curious about our new podcast, then the first episode is in the bottom left. Click or tap on either of those and I'll see you over there.